So what can we do with this data that's gathered every minute and has 4,000 rows and doesn't start and end at the same time? How can we look at this data and make some sense of it? First way is to insert a pivot table, because that's a good way to get an overview of your data and have Excel do the hard work of aggregating it into averages by hours and days. You go to Insert Pivot Table, and we're in this table tracker, and it's saying, is that where you want the data to come from? Do you want to put it into a new worksheet or somewhere here on this worksheet? I recommend putting it into a new worksheet, especially when you've got this much data. And that opens up this Pivot Table Fields dialog. Yours might look a little bit differently. I like to have mine side by side, and you can just click this gear icon here to change the configuration. For sure, we know that we want to see averages by hour and day. So I'm going to use local start time, because that's a good default for the date stamp of measurements. And I'm going to just pull that down into rows. And you can see, because Excel knows that it's a date time field, it already suggests grouping by days and hours. And if you don't want to see those, you can uncheck those. And then if you decide to have them back, you can add them later. But that looks good. We do want it broken up by hour and day. And what we want to look at is AQI. So I'm going to select AQI and pull it down here in the sum of values field. Because everything's normally about money, it thinks you want the sum, but we want the average. So I'm going to click this, left click it, and then select Value Field Settings. Then I'm going to change this to Summarize Value Field by Average. And because we have one significant digit after the decimal in our source data, I'm going to keep that and change the format to one decimal place and say OK. And now you can see that we've got the average of the AQI over the days that the measurements were made. I also want to see the max of the AI, like the max per hour. So to do that, I'm going to select AQI again and pull it down into the Sum Values panel. And I'm going to left click this Sum of AQI, which is the default, select Value Field Settings, and here I'm going to select Max, and I'm going to change the format to the same as the source data, to one digit after the decimal, and say OK. And now we have the max of the AQI for the date or time. So let's click anywhere outside the pivot table fields, and that disappears. If you want that panel back, you can click in your pivot table, and if for some reason it doesn't come back, it'll be over here. If you're in a pivot table, this will come up, Pivot Table Analyze, and then you could check, uncheck the field list here. One thing that is inappropriate is this word grand total. That's the default, but what this means is that 7.2 is the average, because these values are the average over the entire measurement period. And then this value 63, because this is max, then this grand total means max of the max. But it doesn't make too much sense for environmental data. So I'm going to uncheck grand total by clicking on Design, and then uncheck and then check off for rows and columns. Now you can see that the pivot table collapses everything to the day. If you want to see values by hour, click on one of these plus buttons by the day, and you could see that individual average and then the max AQI for that hour is shown. If for some reason you want to see the actual minute, the original measurements, those are shown here as well. And you can see there's no plus sign there, because that is as granular as it gets at the original data. To see that back, you collapse them again. If you wanted to group these by something else, or for example, if you didn't have the hours and days in here, you could click anywhere in the row labels column, right click, And here you see group and ungroup. So if you select group, you could see that there's more options too. Like if you had measurements down to the second, like if you had millisecond, you could group by seconds. You could group by months, quarters, and years. Of course, we only have 4 days, so that doesn't make much sense, and Excel knew that. You could also group things starting at or ending at different times in your data. You could say OK to this, and you could see it pulls everything out to the original measurements. So this is a really good way to get a sense of the averages and the maxes in your data just looking at one parameter. Now, if you wanted to add PM 2.5, you could add that as another series by pulling it down, and then you would left click that, click value settings because you don't want the sum, you want usually average, and we're going to say number format, and we're going to keep the original source data, significant figures, which is 1, say OK, OK, and now if I click outside that pivot table panel, but you could see that this is useful now too, because we could look and compare at AQI versus just the one parameter 2.5 and get a sense of where that AQI comes from.